It started when my stepdad, Ray, smashed my phone against the kitchen counter. My mom nodded approvingly and called it discipline. But what they didn't know was that every screenshot, every recording, every piece of evidence of their toxic behavior had been automatically backing up to the cloud for months, and I was about to use it all. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sound still echoes in my head sometimes. That sharp crack of glass meeting granite, followed by the satisfied grunt Ray made as he swept the pieces into his palm like he'd just solved the world's problems. My phone, my lifeline, my connection to the outside world, my documentation of everything reduced to electronic confetti in under 3 seconds. "There," he said, dusting off his hands with theatrical finality. "Maybe now you'll learn some respect in this house." My mother, Patricia, stood behind him with her arms crossed, wearing that tight smile she reserved for moments when she wanted to look supportive but couldn't quite hide her discomfort. "Your stepfather's right, Zara. You've been glued to that thing for too long anyway. Consider this a digital detox." I was 17 then, a senior at Riverside High in the small town of Millbrook, Vermont. Ray had moved in 2 years earlier with his collection of motivational business books, his protein shake ritual, and his unshakable belief that teenage girls needed firm boundaries to become productive members of society. He spoke in corporate buzzwords even during family dinners, turning every conversation into a TED Talk about accountability and personal growth. The phone incident wasn't random. It was the culmination of weeks of escalating control tactics disguised as parental concern. First, it was the Wi-Fi password changing daily to encourage family interaction. Then it was mandatory phone-free dinner times that stretched from 5 p.m. to 9 p.m. Then it was the new rule that all devices had to be docked in the kitchen charging station every night by 8 p.m., which really meant Ray got to scroll through my messages while I did homework. But I wasn't just some helpless teenager getting steamrolled by an overbearing step-parent. See, while Ray was busy playing suburban dictator, I was learning something far more valuable than his lectures about digital responsibility. I was learning that information is power, and power is useless unless you know how to preserve it and deploy it strategically. The phone he destroyed? It was already a decoy. 3 months earlier, after Ray's first random phone inspection where he lectured me about inappropriate conversations with friends and deleted half my photos, I'd gotten smart. My real phone, a budget Android I bought with money from my part-time job at Henderson's Coffee Roasters, lived in a hidden pocket I'd sewn into my backpack. The iPhone Ray just obliterated was my older device, the one I used for decoy activities, meaningless group chats, and carefully curated content designed to make him feel like he was maintaining control. But here's where it gets interesting. That decoy phone wasn't useless. It was bait, and for 3 months it had been automatically recording every single interaction in our house. Ray didn't know about the voice activation recording app I'd installed. He didn't know about the motion-triggered video recordings. He definitely didn't know about the cloud storage account that had been quietly archiving every piece of evidence of his controlling behavior, his explosive temper, his inappropriate comments about my appearance, his threats, and most importantly, my mother's complicity in all of it. The app was called Silent Witness, originally designed for domestic abuse survivors to gather evidence safely. I discovered it in a Reddit thread about toxic family situations, buried in a comment that someone probably typed with shaking hands at 2 a.m. The beautiful thing about Silent Witness was that it looked like a calculator app on the surface. Ray had seen it dozens of times during his phone inspections, probably congratulated himself on his stepdaughter finally using educational tools. What he was actually looking at was a sophisticated evidence-gathering system that had been documenting his reign of terror with forensic precision. Every time he screamed at me for disrespecting his authority, every time he made snide comments about my weight, my friends, my college plans, every time he threatened to show me what real consequences look like if I didn't fall in line, every time my mother sat silently or worse, actively supported his psychological warfare, with phrases like, "He's just trying to help you grow up," and "You need to learn to accept feedback." All of it. Time-stamped, categorized, backed up across multiple cloud platforms. The day Ray destroyed my phone, we were in the middle of what he called a family meeting, but what actually was a tribunal where he explained why my recent behavior, which included the heinous crimes of staying out until 10:30 p.m. with friends and forgetting to empty the dishwasher twice, indicated a pattern of defiance that required immediate correction. I had been sitting at our kitchen table, the same table where we pretended to be a happy blended family during the first few months of their relationship, watching him pace back and forth like a corporate consultant delivering bad news to a failing startup. My mother perched on the edge of her chair, playing her usual role of supportive but concerned audience member. "Your stepfather's right. The root issue," he announced, stopping mid-pace to point at me, "is that you've been enabled to believe that your personal desires matter more than family harmony. That phone has become a symbol of your resistance to structure." I could have argued. I could have pointed out that my grades were excellent, that I worked 20 hours a week, that I'd never been in serious trouble at school, that his definition of family harmony seemed to require my complete psychological submission. I could have mentioned that most of my friends had later curfews and more freedom, or that his structure felt suspiciously like the control tactics we'd studied in my psychology elective. Instead, I just sat there and let him perform. Because by then, I understood something Ray didn't. The person who talks the loudest is rarely the person with the most power. Real power is quiet, patient, and prepared. "Hand it over," he finally said, extending his palm like he was asking for car keys. I looked at my mother. She avoided eye contact. I looked back at Ray, this man who had inserted himself into our lives with promises of stability and partnership, who had slowly revealed himself to be a tyrant with a business degree and a subscription to alpha male podcasts. Then I placed the phone in his hand and watched him destroy it with the kind of satisfied violence that probably felt to him like justice being served. What Ray didn't realize as he swept those glass fragments into the trash was that he had just eliminated the one thing that might have protected him from what was coming next, because the evidence was already in the cloud, and I was about to reign. Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. I should probably back up and explain how we got here, because the Ray who destroyed my phone wasn't the Ray who first walked into our lives with flowers and promises of finally giving you girls the stability you deserve. That Ray had been charming. Successful. He owned a consulting firm called Apex Solutions that helped underperforming businesses unlock their potential. His words. Always his words. He drove a spotless silver BMW or expensive cologne that somehow made our small living room smell like success, and had this way of listening to my mother talk about her day at the elementary school where she taught third grade like she was delivering groundbreaking research. For the first 6 months, Ray was everything my mother had been hoping for since my father died in a construction accident when I was 12. He took us to nice restaurants where he knew the servers by name. He fixed our leaky bathroom faucet without being asked. He attended my school plays and actually seemed interested when I explained my science fair projects about renewable energy systems. Most importantly, he made my mother laugh again. Really laugh. Not the polite chuckles she'd been forcing for years whenever people made jokes about single motherhood or asked when she was going to get back out there. Ray made her feel seen, valuable, worth pursuing. And after watching her struggle through 5 years of grief, loneliness, and financial stress while raising a teenager alone, I wanted that for her. I remembered the exact moment I realized Ray wasn't who he pretended to be. It was during my sophomore year, about 8 months after he'd moved in. I was working on a history essay about civil rights movements, and I'd left my laptop open on the kitchen table while I went to grab a snack. When I came back, Ray was scrolling through my Google search history. Not actively hiding it, not looking guilty or apologetic, just casually reviewing my academic research like he was checking a weather app. When I asked what he was doing, he didn't even look up.
I'm just making sure you're staying focused on appropriate content. Your mother and I discussed the importance of monitoring your internet activities. There's a lot of dangerous material out there that can influence impressionable minds." The word discussed hit different than it should have. My mother had never mentioned monitoring my internet usage. She trusted me, had always trusted me, knew I was responsible, and focused on school. But when I asked her about it later, she just gave me this tired smile and said, "Ray has experience with teenage behavior from his corporate trading programs. Maybe we should listen to his expertise." That was the beginning of the slow erosion. Not dramatic, not sudden, just a gradual shift in the rules and expectations that somehow always seemed reasonable when Ray explained them. First, it was internet monitoring for my own safety. Then it was earlier curfews because successful people understand the value of routine. Then it was restrictions on which friends I could spend time with because some of them came from unstable family environments that might be negative influences. Each new rule came with a business presentation. Ray would literally create PowerPoint slides explaining why these boundaries were necessary for my personal development and future success. He had charts about teenage brain development, statistics about social media's impact on academic performance, case studies from his consulting work about the importance of structured environments. My mother would nod along like she was attending a PTA meeting, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but never challenging the fundamental premise that I needed to be managed like a failing department in one of his client companies. The worst part wasn't the rules themselves. It was watching my mother disappear into them. The woman who had raised me to think critically, to question authority, to stand up for myself, was suddenly deferring to Ray's expertise on everything from what I should eat for breakfast to which colleges I should consider applying to.
When I tried to push back, Ray had a term for it: adjustment resistance. Apparently, this was a common phenomenon in blended families where teenagers struggled to accept new leadership structures. He had strategies for overcoming it, mostly involving consistent consequences and unified parental responses. My mother, who had been my advocate and ally my entire life, became his lieutenant. By my junior year, our house felt like living inside a corporate retreat designed by someone who had read too many books about optimizing human potential, but had never actually lived with a human teenager. Every conversation was a performance review. Every mistake was a learning opportunity that required extensive debriefing. Every sign of independence was evidence of my failure to embrace collaborative family dynamics. Ray started timing my showers to ensure efficient water usage. He implemented a point system for household chores that determined weekend privileges. He created a family mission statement that we had to recite during Sunday dinners. He insisted on approving my part-time job at Henderson's Coffee Roasters because he wanted to ensure it aligned with my long-term career trajectory. But the phone monitoring was what finally broke something inside me. Not just the fact that he was reading my messages, but the way he'd bring up private conversations I'd had with friends during his coaching sessions about my social development. The way he'd quote my own words back to me as evidence of concerning thought patterns. The way he'd turn my most personal communications into ammunition for his psychological warfare. That's when I started researching. Not school research this time, but survival research. I spent hours in the public library using their computers to learn about emotional manipulation, about control tactics, about the difference between legitimate parental concern and psychological abuse. I read forums where other teenagers described similar experiences. I studied articles about narcissistic personality patterns and coercive control. And I learned about documentation. The first time I recorded Ray was almost by accident. I had been using my phone's voice memo app to practice a speech for my English class, and I forgot to turn it off when he started one of his improvement discussions about my attitude problem. Later, when I played it back,
I heard something I'd never noticed before. The pattern. How he'd start with false concern, how he'd gradually escalate the criticism, how he'd twist my responses into evidence of defiance, how he'd end by positioning himself as the victim of my disrespectful behavior, while simultaneously offering to help me grow through his guidance. It was so calculated, so systematic, that hearing it played back felt like watching a predator hunt. That's when I got serious about the Silent Witness app. That's when I started treating our house like a crime scene that needed to be documented. That's when I realized that Ray's biggest weakness wasn't his temper or his ego. It was his absolute certainty that he was smarter than everyone around him, especially me. He never suspected that the quiet, compliant teenager he thought he was molding was actually building a case against him, one recorded conversation at a time. By the time Ray smashed that decoy phone, I had 3 months of evidence. 3 months of his real voice, his real words, his real methods. 3 months of my mother's complicity and silence. 3 months of proof that their parenting was actually systematic psychological abuse disguised as family structure. And now, with the decoy phone destroyed and Ray feeling triumphant about finally getting through to me, it was time to show him what real power looked like. It was time to show both of them that underestimating someone's intelligence is the most expensive mistake you can make. Because while Ray had been busy playing corporate dictator, I had been learning the most important lesson of all. The person who controls the information controls the outcome. And I controlled everything. 3 days passed before I made my first move, and those 3 days were the longest performance of my life. I had to be the perfect picture of a chastened teenager learning her lesson, absorbing Ray's wisdom, grateful for the tough love that was helping me grow into a more responsible young adult. During breakfast, I nodded thoughtfully when he explained how my phone addiction had been sabotaging my potential. At dinner, I asked follow-up questions about his business philosophy and how it applied to personal development. When my mother mentioned how nice it was to see me engaging with family instead of staring at a screen, I smiled and agreed that this digital detox was exactly what I needed. The hardest part wasn't the acting. It was watching my mother buy into it completely. She actually seemed proud of Ray's breakthrough with me, commenting to her sister on the phone about how much more present and mature I seemed without the constant distraction of technology. She credited Ray's structured approach and talked about what a good influence he was becoming in my life. Meanwhile, my hidden phone continued its silent documentation. Every condescending lecture, every moment of Ray explaining to my mother how teenage brains work, and every instance of him positioning himself as the family's psychological expert, all of it flowing into my cloud storage with timestamp precision. But the real revelation came on Wednesday evening during what Ray called our first progress evaluation meeting. He'd set up the living room like a corporate conference space, complete with a legal pad for notes and his laptop open to what looked like a presentation template. My mother sat beside him on the couch, playing the role of supportive co-manager, while I took the chair across from them like I was interviewing for a job I desperately needed.
I had prepared for this moment, rehearsed my response to sound properly reflective and grateful. Honestly, Ray, I didn't realize how much the phone was affecting my ability to be present with family. I feel more grounded now. He made a note on his pad, actually wrote something down like my response was data to be analyzed. That's excellent self-awareness, he said. Your mother and I have noticed significant improvements in your engagement levels and overall attitude. Would you say this experience has helped you understand why we felt intervention was necessary? The clinical language made my skin crawl, but I maintained my expression of earnest gratitude. Definitely, I can see now that what felt like punishment was actually guidance, helping me break patterns that weren't serving me. My mother beamed like I'd just won the Nobel Prize. Oh, honey, I'm so glad you can see that now. Ray was right about you just needing time to process the changes. That was the moment Ray made his critical mistake. Emboldened by what he perceived as his complete victory over my resistance, he decided to share his broader vision for my continued development. Now that we've established this foundation, he said, leaning forward with the enthusiasm of a consultant who just landed a major contract, I think we can implement some additional structure that will really accelerate your growth trajectory. He opened his laptop and turned the screen toward me. It was a PowerPoint presentation titled Zara's Success Framework Phase 2. I wish I could say I was prepared for what came next, but even with all my documentation and strategic thinking, I wasn't ready for the scope of Ray's ambitions for controlling my life. Phase 2 included a complete overhaul of my social connections. Ray had researched my friends' families and created categories based on what he called influence potential. Friends from high-achieving households were approved for continued contact. Friends from unstable environments, which seemed to include anyone whose parents were divorced, struggling financially, or didn't have college degrees, were to be phased out gradually. He'd analyzed my academic performance and decided that my current course load wasn't optimally challenging. He wanted to meet with my school counselor to restructure my senior year schedule, adding advanced placement classes that aligned with his vision of my college preparation, regardless of my actual interests or career goals. Most disturbing of all, he'd created what he called a college selection matrix that ranked universities not by my preferences or academic strengths, but by their proximity to home and the parental involvement opportunities they offered. Translation, he wanted me to attend schools where he could continue monitoring and controlling my development throughout my college years. The goal, he explained, with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted his right to redesign another person's entire existence, is to create sustainable systems that will support your success even when you're not living under direct supervision. Think of it as installing internal management protocols. My mother sat there nodding like this was reasonable parenting instead of a complete blueprint for psychological control that would extend well into my adult life. She actually asked follow-up questions about implementation timelines and progress metrics. I sat in that chair, listening to them plan my future like I was a business being restructured, and felt something shift inside me that was bigger than anger or frustration. It was clarity. Pure, crystalline understanding of exactly who Ray was and what he intended to do to my life. This wasn't about teaching me responsibility or helping me grow. This was about creating a long-term psychological dependency that would keep me under his influence indefinitely. Ray wasn't trying to prepare me for independence. He was systematically destroying my ability to ever become truly independent. And my mother wasn't just enabling it, she was actively collaborating in the elimination of my autonomy because Ray had convinced her it was sophisticated parenting. What do you think, sweetheart? Doesn't this sound like an amazing opportunity to really set yourself up for success? I looked at her face full of hope and pride in her husband's expertise and realized that I wasn't just gathering evidence against Ray anymore. I was documenting the complete psychological colonization of my family. It sounds very thorough, I managed to say, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. Can I have some time to process all of this? Ray smiled like a salesman who'd just closed a major deal. Of course, take all the time you need. We're not in any rush. The goal is your buy-in, not compliance. We want you to understand that this is about your empowerment, not our control. The word empowerment coming out of his mouth while he detailed his plan to eliminate every aspect of my personal autonomy was so perfectly Ray that I almost laughed out loud. Instead, I nodded thoughtfully and asked if I could be excused to go do homework in my room. They agreed, probably interpreting my request as evidence that their motivational presentation had inspired me to be more academically focused. I sat on my bed, looking at the automatic transcription of their presentation, and realized that Ray had just given me everything I needed to destroy him completely. Not just his control over me, but his credibility, his business reputation, his marriage, and his future. He thought he'd been presenting a success framework. What he'd actually done was confess to psychological abuse while detailing his plans to escalate it. And every word was safely stored in the cloud, waiting for the right moment to change everything. The morning after the phone destruction, I woke up to the sound of Ray's electric toothbrush buzzing through the thin walls of our ranch house on Maple Street. It was 5:47 a.m. I knew because my hidden phone was tucked under my pillow, silently vibrating with notifications I couldn't check until I was sure the coast was clear. Ray kept military-precise morning routines. Alarm at 5:30, bathroom until 6:15, protein shake and motivational podcast until 6:45, then suited up and out the door by 7 to conquer another day of helping businesses reach their potential. His predictability was both suffocating and useful. I always knew exactly when I had privacy and when I didn't. I lay there listening to his routine through the walls, thinking about how different this morning felt. Yesterday, I had been Zara the compliant stepdaughter, the girl who absorbed his lectures and accepted his punishments with resigned silence. Today, I was Zara the strategist, the girl with 3 months of recorded evidence and a plan that Ray couldn't even imagine. The bathroom door clicked shut, shower water started running. I had exactly 12 minutes before he emerged, which meant 12 minutes to check my real phone and confirm that everything from yesterday had uploaded properly to my secure cloud accounts. I pulled the device from under my pillow and opened the Silent Witness app with trembling fingers. The calculator interface disappeared with my passcode, revealing the dashboard I'd been building for months. Yesterday's recordings were all there, crystal clear, and automatically transcribed by the app's AI system. Ray's voice recorded in perfect quality. Maybe now you'll learn some respect in this house. My mother's voice, equally clear. Consider this a digital detox. But it wasn't just the phone destruction that had been captured. The app had been running during the entire family meeting that led up to it. 47 minutes of Ray explaining why I needed immediate correction, why my behavior indicated concerning patterns, why destroying my property was actually tough love designed to help me grow. 47 minutes of psychological manipulation recorded in Ray's own words with timestamps and metadata that would hold up in any legal proceeding. I scrolled through the automatic transcription, reading words that felt like emotional assault yesterday, but looked like evidence today. The app had even flagged certain phrases in red, patterns it had identified as consistent with domestic violence cases based on its database of domestic violence cases. Subject demonstrates classic control escalation, financial leverage referenced repeatedly, isolation tactics documented, parental alienation indicators present. It was like having a domestic abuse expert analyzing my life in real time, giving me professional vocabulary for experiences I'd only been able to describe as Ray being a jerk. The shower shut off, 8 minutes until he emerged. I quickly navigated to my backup cloud accounts. I'd been paranoid enough to set up 3 separate services, all under fake email addresses created at the public library. Everything was there, safely stored and accessible from any internet connection in the world. But the real treasure wasn't yesterday's recording. It was the compilation I'd been building, a greatest hits collection of Ray's most damning moments, organized by category and severity. I had him threatening to show you what real consequences look like if you didn't fall in line. I had him making inappropriate comments about my body during his lectures about presenting yourself professionally. I had him telling my mother that I was manipulative and showing signs of personality disorders that needed to be addressed before college. Most damaging of all, I had the recordings where he coached my mother on how to respond when I tried to talk to her privately, how he'd trained her to redirect my concerns back to him, how he'd convinced her that my attempts to maintain our mother-daughter relationship were actually triangulation designed to undermine family unity. I heard his electric toothbrush start up again. 5 more minutes. The beautiful thing about the Silent Witness app was that it didn't just record, it analyzed. It had been learning Ray's patterns, identifying his manipulation techniques, even predicting when he was most likely to escalate based on vocal stress patterns and conversation triggers. The app had become like having a psychological profiler living in my phone, documenting not just what Ray did, but how and why he did it. According to the analysis, Ray's behavior had escalated significantly over the past month. The app had detected increased aggression in his tone, more frequent use of intimidation tactics, and what it classified as pre-violence indicators in several recent recordings. In clinical terms, Ray wasn't just being controlling anymore, he was becoming dangerous. That realization hit me harder than I expected. I'd been so focused on gathering evidence and planning my countermove that I hadn't fully processed how serious this had become. The app was essentially telling me that I was living with someone who showed signs of potentially escalating to physical violence. My hands shook as I screenshotted the analysis report. This wasn't just about winning an argument with my stepfather anymore. This was about safety, mine and potentially my mother's. The bathroom door opened. I quickly closed the app and shoved the phone back under my pillow, rolling over to face the wall and pretending to sleep. Ray's footsteps padded down the hallway toward the kitchen, where I could hear him beginning his protein shake routine. Lying there, listening to the familiar sounds of Ray's morning routine, I realized something had fundamentally shifted in my perspective. Yesterday, I'd thought of myself as a teenager dealing with an overbearing step-parent. Today, I understood that I was a potential victim of domestic abuse who had accidentally created a comprehensive legal case against her abuser. The weight of that knowledge was both terrifying and empowering. Terrifying because it meant I was in more danger than I'd realized. Empowering because it meant I had more power than Ray could possibly imagine. My mother's alarm went off in their bedroom. Soon she'd be padding to the kitchen in her robe, accepting the coffee Ray made for her every morning, participating in the illusion that we were a normal, functional family. She'd probably ask how I was adjusting to life without my phone, maybe suggest some family activities to help me reconnect with the real world. What she wouldn't know was that I'd spent the night becoming more connected than ever, not to social media or teenage drama, but to a network of resources and support systems designed specifically for people in situations like mine. The Silent Witness app had connected me to online counselors, legal resources, and safety planning tools. I'd spent hours reading about escape strategies and evidence preservation. I wasn't just some angry teenager anymore. I was an informed survivor with documentation, backup plans, and professional-grade evidence of ongoing psychological abuse. The coffee maker gurgled to life downstairs. Ray's voice carried up through the heating vents as he began his morning briefing with my mother, his daily download of how I'd performed yesterday, what corrections needed to be implemented today, and what progress indicators they should monitor to ensure I was learning from consequences. Except today, for the first time, I wasn't just the subject of their discussion. I was documenting it. The Silent Witness app was running on my real phone, capturing every word of their private strategy session about how to further control and manipulate me. By the time I got dressed and went downstairs for breakfast, I'd already collected another 15 minutes of evidence. Ray and my mother plotting my psychological management like I was a problematic employee who needed performance improvement. "Good morning, Zara," Ray said with false cheerfulness as I entered the kitchen. "How are we feeling about yesterday's learning experience?" I looked at him across our kitchen table, the same table where he'd destroyed my phone less than 24 hours earlier, and smiled. "Actually, Ray," I said, pouring myself orange juice with steady hands, "I learned more than you could possibly imagine." He nodded approvingly, completely misinterpreting my response as submission. That's exactly the kind of mature reflection I was hoping to see. Growth mindset is everything. What Ray didn't realize was that my phone was recording this conversation, too, and that his satisfied smile, his patronizing tone, his complete certainty that he'd successfully broken me down all of it was going directly into my evidence file. Because the most important thing I'd learned in the past 24 hours wasn't about phones or punishment or family dynamics. It was about patience and preparation, and the fact that the person who thinks they've won is usually the person who's about to lose everything. Ray sipped his protein shake and scrolled through his phone, probably checking emails from clients who paid him thousands of dollars for advice about optimizing human potential. What he couldn't have known was that he was about to become a case study himself in what happens when a controlling abuser underestimates the intelligence, resourcefulness, and determination of the person they're trying to destroy. The evidence was in the cloud, the plan was taking shape, and Ray had no idea what was coming for him. 3 days passed in a strange kind of suspended animation. Ray basked in what he believed was his victory, commenting repeatedly about how focused and present I seemed without the distraction of my phone. He actually used me as a success story during one of his client calls, which I overheard through the thin walls of his home office. Sometimes you have to make the hard choices, he told whoever was paying for his wisdom that day. My stepdadder was completely addicted to her device, classic teenage behavior, but we implemented a consequence-based intervention, and the results have been remarkable. She's more engaged, more respectful, more open to guidance. It's a perfect example of how strategic disruption can create positive behavioral change. I sat in the hallway, outside his office, my real phone recording every word, marveling at how Ray had turned destroying my property into a business case study. He was literally monetizing his abuse, packaging it as leadership advice for corporate clients who probably had teenagers of their own. The irony was suffocating. While Ray congratulated himself on his parenting expertise, I was documenting his every move with forensic precision. The Silent Witness app had become like having a private investigator living in my backpack, capturing not just his words, but the patterns beneath them. During those 3 days, I learned things about Ray that I'd never consciously noticed before. How he modulated his voice differently when talking to his male clients versus his female clients. How he used different manipulation tactics on me versus my mother. How he consistently positioned himself as the victim when anyone questioned his methods. Most revealing was a conversation I recorded on Wednesday evening when my mother finally worked up the courage to suggest that maybe destroying my phone had been a little extreme. "Patricia," Ray's voice came through crystal clear on the recording. "This is exactly the kind of second-guessing that undermines effective parenting. You hired me to help create structure in this family, and now you want to question the methods when they're actually working? I didn't hire you, Ray. We're partners in this." "Are we? Because when I see you doubting decisions we made together, it feels like you're choosing her manipulation over our relationship. Is that what's happening here?" The conversation went on for 23 minutes. By the end, my mother was apologizing for not trusting his expertise and promising to stay unified in their approach to managing me. Ray had turned her moment of maternal instinct into evidence of her disloyalty, then manipulated her guilt until she was thanking him for his patience with her inconsistency. It was masterful, in the most horrifying way possible, and it was all recorded in high-definition audio with automatic transcription and psychological pattern analysis. But the real breakthrough came on Thursday afternoon when I was alone in the house doing homework. Ray was at a client meeting across town, my mother was at her monthly teacher's workshop at the district office, and I had 3 uninterrupted hours to dig deeper into the evidence I had been collecting. I'd been thinking about something the Silent Witness app had flagged in its analysis reports: financial leverage. The app had identified multiple instances where Ray referenced money, expenses, and financial dependence as tools of control, but I hadn't fully understood what that meant until I started connecting the dots. Using my real phone, I logged into our family's shared computer remotely, a trick I'd learned in my AP computer science class that Ray knew nothing about. I wasn't looking to steal or hack anything, just to understand the financial picture that Ray kept using as ammunition against my mother and me. What I found was worse than I had expected. Ray hadn't just moved into our house and our lives, he'd systematically taken control of our finances. My mother's teacher salary was now being direct deposited into a joint account that Ray managed. The mortgage on our house, which my mother had been paying for 8 years before Ray arrived, had been refinanced in both their names, with Ray as the primary account holder. Even more disturbing, I found email exchanges between Ray and my mother's school district about her retirement contributions. Ray had somehow convinced her to let him optimize her retirement planning, which apparently meant redirecting her pension contributions into investment accounts that he controlled. My mother, who had been fiercely independent before Ray arrived, who had rebuilt her entire life after my father's death, who had worked 2 jobs to keep us afloat during the hardest years, she had been financially absorbed by Ray's expertise without even realizing it. The emails showed a pattern that matched everything else about Ray's behavior. He'd positioned himself as the financial expert, gradually convinced my mother that she was making suboptimal decisions with her money, then slowly assumed control over every aspect of our economic life. The house we lived in, the car my mother drove, even the groceries we ate. It all flowed through accounts and systems that Ray managed. I screenshotted everything, uploaded it to my secure cloud storage, and added it to the growing file that was starting to look less like a collection of family grievances and more like a comprehensive case study in coercive control. But the real breakthrough came on Thursday afternoon when I was alone in the house doing homework. Ray was at a client meeting across town, my mother was at her monthly teacher's workshop at the district office, and I had 3 uninterrupted hours to dig deeper into the evidence I'd been collecting. Inside were documents that made my blood freeze, spreadsheets tracking my behavior, my conversations, my compliance metrics, reports analyzing my resistance patterns and intervention opportunities, even a timeline for something called Phase 2 implementation, which appeared to involve expanded behavioral modification and reduced external influences. There were also research documents Ray had saved about teenage psychology, residential treatment programs, and therapeutic boarding schools for defiant adolescents. He'd been researching ways to send me away if his current control methods didn't achieve what he called complete compliance. I stared at my phone screen, reading Ray's clinical analysis of my personality and his strategic plans for my future, feeling like I'd accidentally uncovered a serial killer's journals. This wasn't parenting. This wasn't even abuse in the traditional sense. This was systematic psychological experimentation, with me as the unwilling subject. The most chilling document was titled Patricia Management Strategy, which laid out Ray's plan for maintaining control over my mother's decision-making. It included sections on emotional dependency cultivation, financial leverage maintenance, and external support system neutralization. Ray had literally created a manual for keeping my mother isolated and dependent on his guidance. Reading through his strategy documents, I realized something that changed everything about how I understood our situation. Ray wasn't just a controlling stepfather who'd gotten carried away with his authority. He was a predator who had identified a vulnerable single mother and her teenage daughter as targets for long-term exploitation. The phone destruction hadn't been about discipline or tough love. It had been a field test of his control systems, a way to measure how much resistance I could mount and how effectively he could manipulate my mother into supporting his actions. According to his own documents, I was supposed to be completely compliant by now, grateful for his guidance and eager to please. The fact that I wasn't, the fact that I seemed focused and present but not broken, was actually confusing him. I scrolled through weeks of his behavior analysis, watching him try to understand why his psychological manipulation wasn't achieving the results his research suggested it should. He documented every interaction, every punishment, every reward, treating our family like a laboratory experiment. What Ray didn't know was that his experiment had a contaminated subject. While he'd been studying me, I'd been studying him. While he'd been documenting my behavior, I'd been documenting his. While he'd been building strategies to control me,
I'd been building evidence to destroy him.
And now I had access to his research, his plans, his private thoughts about how to manipulate and control my mother and me. I had his own words in his own documents proving premeditation and systematic abuse. The hunter had become the hunted, and he had no idea that the trap was already set. But I knew that having evidence wasn't enough. I needed a plan for deploying it that would protect my mother and me while ensuring that Ray couldn't manipulate his way out of the consequences. Because according to his own timeline, Phase 2 was supposed to begin next week, and I had no intention of letting Ray find out what I'd discovered before I was ready to use it against him. Friday morning brought an unexpected complication. I was sitting in AP Psychology, half listening to Ms. Rodriguez explain cognitive dissonance theory, when my hidden phone buzzed with an emergency alert from the Silent Witness app. High priority incident detected. Immediate review recommended. My stomach dropped. The app only sent emergency alerts when it detected patterns consistent with imminent physical violence or extreme psychological escalation. I raised my hand and asked for a bathroom pass, then locked myself in a stall to check the recording. It was from this morning, captured while I was getting ready for school. Ray and my mother in the kitchen having what sounded like a normal conversation about weekend plans. But the app's AI had flagged something in Ray's vocal patterns, micro-expressions of stress, elevated aggression markers, and what it classified as pre-event behavioral indicators. I plugged in my earbuds and listened to the full recording. On the surface, Ray sounded normal, discussing whether to invite his business partner Marcus over for dinner, asking about my mother's schedule, making jokes about finally having a phone-free weekend with me. But underneath the casual conversation, the app had detected something else. Ray's baseline stress levels were significantly elevated. His speaking patterns showed signs of suppressed agitation. Most concerning, he'd made 3 separate references to handling problems permanently and making sure situations don't escalate beyond management. The app's analysis suggested that Ray was in what domestic violence experts call a decision point, the psychological state that often precedes major escalation in abusive relationships. Something had triggered him, and he was planning some kind of significant action. I sat in that bathroom stall reading the clinical analysis of my stepfather's psychological state and felt panic rise in my throat. The app was essentially telling me that Ray was becoming dangerous, but I had no idea what had triggered the change or what he was planning to do about it. Then I remembered something from his family development plan documents. Phase 2 implementation was supposed to begin with what he called an intervention event, a planned confrontation designed to establish new parameters and eliminate remaining resistance factors. Ray wasn't just planning to escalate his control, he was planning to stage some kind of family crisis that would justify extreme measures. And according to his timeline, it was supposed to happen this weekend. I spent the rest of the school day in a state of controlled panic, trying to figure out what Ray might be planning and how to protect myself and my mother from whatever was coming. By the time I got home, I'd made a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. I was going to accelerate my own timeline. Instead of waiting to gather more evidence, instead of trying to build the perfect case, I was going to act this weekend. Because if Ray was planning something dramatic, I needed to get ahead of him. The house felt different when I walked through the front door that afternoon. Nothing had changed physically. Same furniture, same smells, same afternoon light streaming through the living room windows. But there was an electric tension in the air, like the moments before a thunderstorm when the atmospheric pressure makes your skin prickle. Ray was in his home office on a client call, door closed, voice carrying through the walls with unusual intensity. My mother was in the kitchen preparing dinner, moving with the quick, nervous energy she always had when Ray was stressed about work. "How was school, honey?" she asked without looking up from the vegetables she was chopping. "Fine," I said, watching her hands shake slightly as she worked. "Mom, are you okay?" She paused, knife hovering over a carrot, then resumed chopping with forced casualness. "Of course. Why would you ask that?" "You seem nervous." "Just tired. It's been a long week."
But I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she kept glancing toward Ray's office, the careful modulation in her voice that meant she was monitoring herself for any word or tone that might set him off. Ray's voice rose through the walls, something about unacceptable performance and immediate corrections. My mother flinched slightly and chopped faster. That's when I realized what had changed. Ray wasn't just stressed, he was in full predator mode, and my mother had picked up on the shift in his energy. She was already bracing for whatever was coming, even if she didn't consciously understand what that was. I went upstairs to my room and immediately opened the Silent Witness app to check if anything else had been recorded since the morning alert. What I found made my hands shake. Ray's client call wasn't about business. It was about me. The app had automatically transcribed the entire conversation, which wasn't with a client at all. It was with someone named Dr. Harrison Kellner, apparently a adolescent behavioral specialist who ran something called Riverside Academy for Troubled Youth. The situation has deteriorated faster than we anticipated. Ray's voice came through clearly in the recording. She's showing signs of covert resistance that suggest she's not responding to standard intervention methods. We may need to move to residential placement sooner than originally planned.
Dr. Kellner's voice was harder to make out, but I caught phrases like assessment protocol, parental rights, and emergency placement procedures. The mother is fully on board, Ray continued. We've been preparing her for this possibility for weeks. She understands that her daughter needs professional help that we can't provide at home. My blood turned to ice water. Ray hadn't just been researching therapeutic boarding schools, he'd been making arrangements to send me to one. And he'd been manipulating my mother into believing it was necessary. The conversation went on for another 15 minutes, with Ray providing what sounded like a clinical assessment of my behavioral problems and concerning patterns. He described incidents that I barely remembered, but twisted through his interpretation, they sounded like evidence of serious psychological issues. He told Dr. Kellner about my defiance, my manipulation tactics, my inability to accept authority. He described the phone destruction as a necessary intervention that had revealed my underlying hostility and potential for escalation. Most chilling, he'd apparently told Dr. Kellner that I'd made threats. Threats I'd never made, conversations that had never happened, incidents that existed only in Ray's strategically constructed narrative. We're concerned about the safety of other family members, Ray said toward the end of the call. Her behavior has become increasingly unpredictable, and we believe she may be planning some kind of retaliation for appropriate parental boundaries. I sat on my bedroom floor listening to Ray systematically build a false case for having me institutionalized, and realized that I'd been thinking about this all wrong. Ray wasn't just planning to escalate his control over me, he was planning to have me removed from the house entirely. And he'd been spending weeks preparing my mother to believe that this was necessary for everyone's safety. The intervention event he'd planned for this weekend wasn't going to be another family meeting or another round of punishments. It was going to be an ambush designed to create evidence that I was dangerous, followed by a call to Dr. Kellner's facility for emergency placement. Ray was planning to have me disappeared. But he'd made one crucial mistake. While he'd been building his false narrative about my dangerous behavior, I'd been building a real case about his systematic abuse. While he'd been manipulating my mother into believing I was the problem, I'd been documenting proof that he was the predator. And while Ray thought he was about to permanently solve his Zara problem, I was about to show him that underestimating someone's intelligence and resources is the kind of mistake that destroys lives. Because I had something Ray didn't know existed. The truth, backed up by months of evidence, stored safely in multiple cloud accounts that he couldn't access or destroy. The hunter was about to become the hunted, and the trap was about to snap shut. I just had to survive the weekend long enough to spring it. That evening, I sat through dinner listening to Ray and my mother make small talk about weekend plans, knowing that they were both performing for my benefit. Ray was his usual charming self,
asking about my classes, making jokes, acting like the concerned stepfather who just wanted what was best for his family. My mother played along, though I could see the strain in her smile, the way she kept glancing at Ray for approval before speaking, the careful neutrality in her tone that meant she was afraid of saying the wrong thing. Neither of them knew that I heard Ray's conversation with Dr. Kellner. Neither of them knew that I understood exactly what this weekend was really about. And neither of them knew that while they were planning my destruction, I was planning theirs. Because sometimes the person who looks like they're losing is actually the person who's about to win everything. 6 months later, I was sitting in a coffee shop in Burlington, 3 hours away from Millbrook, reading the final verdict on my laptop screen. The judge had sentenced Ray to 4 years in federal prison for mail fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit domestic abuse. His consulting business had been shut down permanently, and 12 of his former clients were facing their own criminal charges in various states. The restitution payments would take years to process, but my mother had already recovered most of her retirement funds and regained full control of our house and finances. Ray's assets, including his BMW and his office equipment, had been seized and liquidated to compensate his victims, and there were more victims than even I had imagined. During the investigation, federal prosecutors discovered that Ray had been running similar schemes in 3 different states over the past decade. He'd targeted vulnerable single mothers, convinced them to give him financial control, then systematically abused their children while teaching other men to do the same thing to their families. The FBI estimated that his methodology had been used to psychologically torment over 40 children and 23 women across multiple states. My evidence, months of recorded conversations, his own strategic documents, and the workshop footage had been the cornerstone of the federal case. But it was the testimony of other victims that really sealed his fate. Women who had lost their homes, their savings, their children's college funds to raise financial optimization. Teenagers who had been sent to residential facilities because their mothers trusted Ray's assessment that they needed intensive intervention. She was 14 when she was sent away. She testified via video link because she still couldn't be in the same room as men in suits without having panic attacks.
The hardest testimony came from a woman named Carol in Ohio, whose 15-year-old son had attempted suicide after 18 months of Ray's behavioral modification techniques. Her ex-husband had hired Ray during their custody battle, and Ray had coached him on how to use psychological pressure to make the boy choose to live with his father full-time. The boy survived, but he'd required 2 years of intensive therapy to recover from what the court psychologist described as systematic psychological torture. Listening to those testimonies, I understood that my 3 months of documentation hadn't just saved my mother and me, it had prevented Ray from destroying dozens of other families who were scheduled to attend his advanced workshops over the following year. The media coverage had been extensive but respectful. Several journalists had reached out to interview me, but I'd declined most requests. The story was important, but I didn't need to be famous for surviving it. The legal victory was enough. What surprised me most was how normal life felt afterward. I'd expected some kind of dramatic transformation, some sense of triumph or closure that would mark the end of our ordeal. Instead, it just felt like we were finally able to breathe again. My mother had returned to teaching with renewed energy, even taking on a leadership role in her school's anti-bullying program. She'd started therapy to process her own experience of being manipulated and controlled, and she was slowly rebuilding the friendships that Ray had systematically undermined during his campaign to isolate her. We talked about it sometimes, usually late at night when we were both having trouble sleeping. She'd apologized repeatedly for not protecting me, for allowing Ray to manipulate her into supporting his abuse. I'd tried to explain that she was a victim too, that his manipulation of her was just as calculated and systematic as his manipulation of me. "I should have known," she'd say. "I'm your mother. I should have seen what he was doing." "He was a professional," I'd remind her.
He made a living convincing intelligent, caring people to trust his judgment over their own instincts. You weren't weak or naive. You were targeted by someone who had perfected these techniques over years of practice. The truth was that Ray's greatest skill wasn't manipulation, it was selection. He'd identified my mother as someone who would be susceptible to his particular brand of psychological control. Single mothers who had experienced loss, who questioned their parenting abilities, who wanted stability for their children badly enough to ignore red flags. He'd probably evaluated dozens of potential targets before choosing her. But he'd made one crucial miscalculation. He'd assumed that a 17-year-old girl who seemed quiet and compliant would be easy to break. He'd never considered the possibility that quiet compliance might actually be strategic patience, and that teenage girls who grew up with smartphones might know more about documentation and evidence preservation than middle-aged men who thought technology was just another tool for control. Now I was starting my freshman year at the University of Vermont, majoring in criminal justice with a focus on domestic violence advocacy. The Silent Witness app developers had reached out to ask if I'd be willing to consult on improvements to their evidence-gathering features. Several legal aid organizations had invited me to speak about technology-assisted evidence collection for abuse survivors. I'd said yes to the consulting work, but no to most of the speaking engagements. I wasn't ready to be the public face of teenage resistance to domestic abuse. Maybe someday, but not yet. For now, I just wanted to study, to learn more about the systems that allow predators like Ray to operate, and to figure out how to build better protections for the families they target. The coffee shop was busy with other college students, most of them stressed about midterms and dating drama and part-time job schedules. Normal teenage problems that felt simultaneously trivial and precious after everything I'd been through. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. "Dinner at 6? I'm making your favorite lasagna." I smiled and typed back, "Absolutely. Need me to pick up anything?" "Just yourself. Love you." "Love you too, Mom." I closed my laptop and gathered my books, thinking about how strange it was that the most radical thing I could do now was simply be a normal college student with normal problems and a normal relationship with her mother. Ray had tried to destroy our family to build his empire of manipulation and control. Instead, he'd accidentally taught us both that we were stronger than we'd ever imagined, and that sometimes the most powerful resistance looks like quiet preparation and patient documentation. The evidence was in the cloud. The truth was preserved, and justice, for once, had actually been served. 3 years later, I stood in front of a congressional subcommittee on technology and domestic violence, holding a small device that looked exactly like a calculator. The same app that had saved my family was now being considered for federal funding as part of a national initiative to help abuse survivors gather evidence safely. The beauty of technology-assisted documentation, I explained to the panel of senators and representatives, is that it not only preserves evidence, but it gives victims back their power to define their own reality when abusers are trying to convince them that their experiences aren't valid. Senator Martinez from California leaned forward. "Miss Chen," "It's Dr. Chen now," I corrected gently, touching the small pin on my lapel that displayed my newly earned PhD in criminal justice and digital forensics. She smiled. "Dr. Chen."
I clicked to the next slide in my presentation, showing statistics that still amazed me. Since the Ray Patterson case became public, over 200,000 domestic abuse survivors have used evidence-gathering apps to document their experiences. This has led to a 340% increase in successful prosecutions for coercive control, and more importantly, it's prevented an estimated 50,000 children from being removed from safe homes by manipulative partners who were gaming the family court system. The numbers were staggering, but behind each statistic was a story like mine. A family that had been targeted by someone who understood how to exploit trust and manipulate systems designed to protect children. The Patterson Network, I continued, ultimately involved over 127 men across 23 states who were paying for training in psychological manipulation techniques disguised as parenting consulting. When we shut down that operation, we didn't just save the families currently being victimized, we prevented thousands of future victims who would have been targeted as these techniques spread. Representative Johnson from Texas, who had initially been skeptical about federal funding for phone apps, was taking notes. Dr. Chen, what would you say to critics who argue that this technology could be misused for false accusations? It was a question I'd expected, and one I'd researched extensively. The evidence standards required by courts haven't changed. These tools simply make it possible for victims to meet those standards when they previously couldn't. The technology includes built-in authentication features, tamper evidence storage, and requires multiple forms of corroboration. It's actually more difficult to fabricate evidence using these systems than it is using traditional methods. I paused, thinking about the dozens of families I'd worked with over the past 3 years through my consulting practice. But more importantly, the data shows that false accusations are incredibly rare in domestic abuse cases, less than 2%, according to FBI statistics. What's much more common is underreporting, because victims don't believe they have enough evidence to be taken seriously. After my testimony, I walked out of the Capitol building into the bright Washington, D.C. morning, my phone already buzzing with messages from advocacy organizations and legal aid groups who had been following the hearing. The federal funding would likely pass, which meant that tools like Silent Witness would be available free of charge to anyone who needed them. My mother was waiting for me at Union Station, having driven down from Vermont to hear my testimony. She looked proud, but also tired, the kind of tired that comes from rebuilding your entire life after discovering that the person you trusted most was systematically destroying it. "How did it go?" she asked, as we found seats on the train back to Burlington. "Good, I think. The funding should pass." I settled into the seat beside her, noticing how different she looked now compared to those final months with Ray. Her shoulders weren't hunched in defensive posture anymore. Her smile reached her eyes. She looked like herself again, but stronger. "I keep thinking about that morning when he broke your phone," she said, staring out the window at the passing countryside. "I was so sure he was helping us, that his structure was what we needed. I can't believe I was so blind to what he was really doing." It was a conversation we'd had many times over the years, but I understood her need to process it repeatedly. Ray's manipulation had been so complete, so professionally executed, that even now she sometimes questions her own memories of that time. "You weren't blind," I said, the same thing I always told her. "You were targeted by someone whose job it was to make you doubt yourself. He spent months studying your vulnerabilities, learning how to exploit your love for me against both of us. You didn't fail as a mother. You were victimized by a predator who was exceptionally good at what he did." She nodded, but I could see she was still working through the guilt. Healing wasn't linear, especially when the abuse had been designed to make the victim feel responsible for their own victimization.
"The important thing," I continued, "is that we survived it. And now we're helping make sure other families don't have to go through what we did." My phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Sarah Winters, the crisis counselor who had helped me understand the scope of Ray's crimes during those first terrifying nights when I was gathering evidence. She'd become a mentor and eventually a colleague as I'd built my career in digital forensics and victim advocacy. "Saw your testimony online. Brilliant as always. The Peterson case in Oregon just closed. Guilty on all counts. 8-year sentence. Your documentation protocols made the difference. Thank you for everything you do." The Peterson case had been one of the most difficult I'd consulted on. A father who was using Ray's exact methodology to systematically abuse his teenage daughter while convincing family court judges that the girl's mother was parental alienation syndrome.
The evidence we'd helped gather had not only saved that family, but had led to a broader investigation of the father's rights consulting network that had been spreading Ray's techniques under the guise of custody advocacy. It was cases like Peterson that reminded me why this work mattered. Every predator we stopped, every family we saved, every child who didn't have to grow up in a household designed to systematically destroy their sense of reality and self-worth, it was all connected to that moment when I decided to fight back against Ray with patience, documentation, and strategic thinking instead of anger and confrontation. As our train pulled into Burlington, I thought about the 17-year-old girl who had sat in her bedroom 3.5 years ago, realizing that her stepfather was planning to send her away to a residential facility while financially enslaving her mother. That girl had been scared, isolated, and convinced that she was powerless against an adult who controlled every aspect of her family's life. She'd been wrong about being powerless, but she'd been right about something else. Information was the key to everything. Document everything. Trust the evidence. Be patient with the process. And never underestimate what quiet preparation can accomplish against loud, confident predators who think they're smarter than everyone around them. My mother and I walked to her car in comfortable silence, both of us thinking about the long journey from that kitchen table where Ray had destroyed my phone to this moment where I was testifying before Congress about protecting other families from people exactly like him. Ray was still in federal prison with 2 more years left on his sentence. His former clients were serving their own sentences or living with permanent criminal records that would follow them forever. The families they'd targeted were rebuilding their lives with therapy, legal support, and the knowledge that their experiences had been real, documented, and validated by the justice system. And I was Dr. Zara Chen, expert witness, federal consultant, and living proof that sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's building a life so meaningful and impactful that your abuser becomes nothing more than a footnote in your origin story. The phone Ray had smashed was long gone, but the cloud backup had been eternal. And the evidence, once preserved, had changed everything.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.